Since the goal of this module is to teach you, the student, how to use the program TNT and indeed to construct phylogenetic trees, firstly, I've had to give some general background on biology. And now I'm going to introduce cladistics and systematics, which are an integral part of phylogenetics. Organisms are diverse, ranging from bacteria and archaea to eukaryota. Biologists group organisms based on shared characteristics. The most meaningful groupings are based on the study of evolutionary relationships among organisms. New methods for constructing evolutionary trees and a sea of molecular sequence data are leading to improved evolutionary hypotheses to explain life's diversification. To understand the history of ancestor-descendant relationships that unites all forms of life is a challenge that cannot be overstated. The fossil record is far from complete, so it cannot construct an infallible document of evolutionary history. Although many questions about life's diversification can be answered by paleontology, many others are left unanswered. Consequently, other types of evidence are relied upon to establish the best hypothesis of evolutionary relationships. It cannot be overemphasized that the outcomes of such studies are hypotheses, and as such, they require further testing. All hypotheses may be disproved by new data, leading to the formation of better, more accurate ideas. The reconstruction and study of evolutionary relationships is called systematics. By looking at the similarities and differences between species, systematics can construct a phylogeny, or an evolutionary tree, which represents a hypothesis about the evolutionary history of an organism or group of related organisms. Similarities include the wide separation of the frontal and malar zygoma postorbital processes, relative proportion of mandibular teeth. Differences include greater posterior width of the nasals, the thicker, more salient inferior edge of the orbit, and the mandible being greatly elevated anteriorly. Darwin envisaged that the history of life could be depicted as a branching tree, the twigs of the tree representing existing species. The joining of the twigs and branches reflects the pattern of common ancestry, back in time to a single common ancestor of all life. The process of descent with a modification from common ancestry results in all species being related in this branching, hierarchical fashion, and their evolutionary history can be depicted using branching diagrams or phylogenetic trees. The figure shows how evolutionary relationships are depicted with a branching diagram. Panthera, Neophylis, and all other taxa of subfamily Felinae share an older common ancestor, and all felids share a more distant common ancestor. Evolution is not always divergent. Often species evolve convergently because they use similar habitats in which similar adaptations are favored. As a result, two species that are not closely related may end up more like each other than they are to their close relatives. The saber-tooth has evolved several times in Eutherian, including placental, and Metatherian, including marsupial mammals. The repeated evolution of the saber-tooth in mammals provides an ideal system for the study of ecomorphological convergence across temporally, biogeographically, and reproductively diverse clades. Commonly called false saber-toothed cats, nimravids are distinguished by their long, laterally compressed upper canines, mandibular flange, and reduced or absent M2, like saber-toothed felids. The cranial morphology of saber-toothed nimravids and felids is not as strongly convergent as their dentition would suggest. Evolutionary reversal, illustrated in this figure, the process in which a species re-evolves the characteristics of an ancestral species, also has this effect. Phenotypic similarity is misleading. Rather, systematics distinguish similarity among species that is inherited from the most common ancestor, which is called derived, from similarity that arose prior to the common ancestor of the group, which is termed ancestral. In this approach, termed cladistics, data on several characters for all the species in the analysis are gathered. The characters should exist in recognizable character states. For example, consider the character manual digit 4 in Neotheropoda. This character has two states, presence in Avirostra and Tetanuri, and absence in Avetheropoda. A cladistic analysis begins by determining the states for several characters for each taxon in the analysis. In the example, in 6, 10 characters are used for 13 taxa. The first character, furcula, is scored as absent in Taua and present in the other taxa. Another character, maxillary fenestra, is absent in all of the taxa except the Avetheropoda taxa. The absence of manual digit 4 is a shared derived feature of Avetheropoda. In contrast, the presence of a furcula in Avetheropoda is an ancestral feature because it is also present in Ceolophysidae, and therefore presumably evolved prior to the common ancestor of Neotheropoda. The presence of a furcula, therefore, does not tell us that Coelosauria is more closely related to Carnosauria than to Spinosauridae. But the shared, derived feature of extremely complex chambers in vertebrates suggests that all Avetheropoda taxa share a common ancestor that existed more recently than the common ancestor of Neotheropoda. Once the data are assembled, the first step in the manual cladistic analysis is to polarize the characters. That is, to determine whether particular character states are ancestral or derived. To polarize the helmetid anterior sclerite and the rostral plate of trilobites, for example, Stein and Selden, 2011, determined that the occurrence of a free anterior sclerite in front of the head shield or tergite was exhibited by the most recent common ancestor of Helmetida, species belonging to certain genera, illustrated in the figure you see. Usually, the fossils available do not represent the most recent common ancestor, or we cannot be confident that they do. As a result, the method of outgroup comparison is used to assign character polarity. To use this method, a species or group of species that is closely related to, but not a member of, the group under study is designated as the outgroup. When the group under study exhibits multiple character states, and one of those states is exhibited by the outgroup, then that state is considered to be ancestral, and other states are considered to be derived. However, outgroup species also evolve from their ancestors, so the outgroup species will not always exhibit the ancestral condition. Once all characters have been polarized, systematists use this information to construct a cladogram, which depicts a hypothesis of evolutionary relationships. Species that share a common ancestor, as indicated by the possession of shared derived characters, are said to belong to a clade. Clades are thus evolutionary units and refer to a common ancestor and all of its descendants. A derived character shared by clade members is called a synapomorphy of that clade. The figure illustrates that a simple cladogram is a nested set of clades, each characterized by its own synapomorphies. For example, Viveridae is a clade for which the perineal gland is a morphological synapomorphy. Ancestral states are also called plesiomorphies, and shared ancestral states are called symplesiomorphies. In contrast to synapomorphies, symplesiomorphies are not informative about phylogenetic relationships. Consider, for example, the character state presence of a viverrid-like basic cranium, which is a primitive feature. Does this mean that Malagasy civetts are more closely related to and shared a more recent common ancestor with Viverridae than to Herpestidae? The answer, of course, is no. Because symplesiomorphies reflect character states inherited from a distant ancestor, they do not imply that species exhibiting that state are closely related. Homoplasy refers to a shared character state that has not been inherited from a common ancestor exhibiting that character state. Homoplasy can result from convergent evolution. For example, the feathered-like teeth of Cryptoprocta ferox, slicing large carnassials, reduction of post-carnassial molars, can be considered as adaptive features to predation, which has occurred by convergence in C. ferox, the Felidae and the Hyenidae. Systematists rely on the principle of parsimony, which favors the hypothesis that requires the fewest assumptions. As a result, the phylogeny that requires the fewest evolutionary events is considered the best hypothesis of phylogenetic relationships. Grouping frogs with salamanders, for example, is favored because it requires only one instance of homoplasy, the multiple origins of taillessness. Whereas a phylogeny in which frogs were most closely related to humans and gorillas would require two homoplastic evolutionary events, the loss of both amniotic membranes and hair in frogs. Systematists in the study of evolutionary relationships, phylogenies or phylogenetic trees, are graphic representations of relationships among species. Similarities of organisms alone does not necessarily correlate with their relatedness, because evolutionary change is not constant in rate and direction. In cladistics, derived character states are distinguished from ancestral character states, and species are grouped based on shared derived character states. Derived characters are determined from comparison to a group known to be closely related, termed an outgroup. A clade contains all descendants of a common ancestor. A cladogram is a hypothetical representation of evolutionary relationships based on derived character states. Homoplasies may give a false picture of relationships. Thank you very much for joining us on Lecture 16. I hope you enjoyed it very much. I'll see you again.